Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining. My name is Claudia Fonadraber. I am the founder and president of KODA. We are a social practice residency for mid-career artists. We organize residencies, exhibitions, and arts education programs. And it's with great honor that we're hosting today's panel discussion. Thank you, Betty, for organizing it. Betty is a current artist in residence at KODA. Our current residency season is entitled Land and Environment. Betty Yu is a socially engaged multimedia artist, photographer, filmmaker, educator, and activist born and raised in New York City to Chinese immigrant parents. Betty integrates documentary film, new media platforms, and community-infused approaches into her artistic practice. Betty's documentary Resilience about her garment worker mother fighting sweatshop conditions screened at the national and international film festivals, including the Margaret Mead Film and Video Festival. Betty's multimedia installation, The Garment Worker, was featured at Tribeca Film Institute's Interactive Showcase. In 2020, she worked with housing activists to create Resistance in Progress, a multimedia installation featured at Queen's Museum. In 2015, Betty co-founded Chinatown Art Brigade, a cultural collective using art to advocate anti-gentrification organizing. Betty is also an adjunct assistant professor teaching new media, film theory, art and video production at various colleges in New York City, including the New School, John Jay College, Pratt Institute, Marymount, Manhattan College, and Hunter College. In addition, Betty sits on the boards of Third World Newsreel and Working Films, two progressive documentary film organizations. She also sits on the advisory board of More Art, and an arts organization promoting public art in the community. Betty holds a BFA from NYU Tisch School of the Arts and MFA in Integrated Media Arts from Hunter College. Betty has close to 20 years of community, media, justice, and labor organizing experience. And Betty is going to introduce the rest of the wonderful speakers today. Betty, the floor is yours.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for the introduction. That was very generous. So I wanted to first acknowledge KODA Lab for the opportunity to participate in the Land and Environment residency. And of course, that culminated into a show at 5 Miles where we were able to, and it's still on display until January 2nd, our work in progress is on display there as a part of a show called Maps. So before we get into, I'll be introducing all the speakers. I'm super excited about this discussion tonight, but I wanted to just give a little bit of a background and an idea and the idea behind organizing this panel tonight. So I am going to share my screen if I can. Just give me 1 second. So I first wanted to do a quick land acknowledgement. And so I was born and raised in Brooklyn. So, but all of New York City was, including Brooklyn, was home to the Lenape Algonquian people. And Canarsie was an ethnic group of Lenape, and Canarsie is what we know as Brooklyn today. So we must pay respect to the Lenape peoples, past, present, and future, and their continuing presence and struggles on their homeland. So no conversation about gentrification and displacement or any other justice-related issues can be had without really first acknowledging that we all stand on occupied, unceded territory of Lenni Lenape in New York City. So I wanted to just talk a little bit about the residency that I did and the sort of the genesis behind putting this panel together. So tonight's panel, the art of community-based mapping and practices and storytelling. So I started to work on this project entitled, still a working title, Mapping Indigenous, Black, and Asian Resistance in New York City during my land and environment residency with KODA Lab on Governor's Island this past fall, 2021. This project has really provided a critical and creative outlet for me as I reflect on the past year and a half of racial justice uprisings in the wake of police murdering of George Floyd and in the face of COVID-related anti-Asian violence. As a longtime activist myself and an avid student of history, I know that white supremacist power structures have always pitted us against each other, people of color against one another. I also know that Black, Indigenous, Asian, and Latinx communities have a lot more in common than differences. So I wanted to use this time sort of to doing deep research on oral histories, maps, archives of photos, anything I could get my hands on. And it's, again, a work in progress, but it was my own therapeutic way of dealing with what we're seeing around us, what's going on, the turmoil around us. So I wanted to provide a visual portal into these stories of resistance that are really rooted here in New York City, that go way back, right? So I specifically focused on the stories of Lower Manhattan and Brooklyn, because I really grew up in Brooklyn, in Sunset Park, but all of Brooklyn, and then going to Lower Manhattan, particularly Chinatown and all of Lower Manhattan as my second home. So as a lifelong New Yorker, I knew little about these histories, actually. I knew sort of the surface, but not the deeper histories. So mapping Indigenous, Black, and Asian resistance in New York City is a work in progress, like I said, that honors the undertold stories of decolonization, liberation, and uprisings against white supremacy, led by people of color on Lenape land, currently known as New York City. It spans the last 400 plus years. So the installation currently, if you see it on view, it features 3 organza banners, a 75-minute video, and a selection of research materials. So these are just images from Governor's Island and me trying to kind of make sense of the material, being frustrated with obviously a lot of these histories are told through the colonizer's lens, right? Very few actual documentation from folks who were directly impacted. But I was able to find some of those source materials. But anyway, as part of my learning process and evolution as an artist, I really wanted to be in dialogue with other New York City-based artists. And I would say you all, which was accidental, I realized we're all born and bred here in New York City. But also, I wanted to be in dialogue with folks whose work I really respect and admire. So I immediately thought of the artists that you'll be hearing from in a moment. Cynthia Tobar, Tomie Arai, and Walis Johnson came to mind. You're going to hear from them, and their work is so multi-layered, integrating community-based mapping, storytelling, archiving into their practice. I'm excited that you'll hear from them as they share their strategies and approaches in storytelling that is rooted in principles of community resilience, collective agency, and self-determination. After the program, after you hear their presentations rather, we'll have a cross dialogue where we'll explore these critical questions around community-based collaborations, ethics around accountability, and justice center framing. And then finally, we'll be hearing from you all. Please type in your questions and comments into the chat. So without further ado, I want to introduce our first speaker, Cynthia Tobar. I'm going to just read a couple of sentences. If you want to read their full bio, you can go to the Eventbrite link, and I'll be putting some links of their work in the chat as well. So Cynthia Tobar is an artist, activist, scholar, archivist, and oral historian who is passionate about creating interactive participatory stories, documenting social change. Cynthia's current research interests are centered on using oral history methodology to understand issues of equity, inclusion, diversity, and anti-racism in higher education. Her multimedia and storytelling work has been shown in solo and group exhibits throughout the city. So without further ado, I give you Cynthia Tobar. Thank you for being here.
And thank you so much, Betty. Let me just get my screen share ready. So again, thank you, Betty, to KODA, and to the rest of this amazing panel for allowing me to share a bit about my work. I got my start as a community activist that discovered this vibrant path to enhance my activism through archival oral history and storytelling work. I primarily work on documenting stories of student activism, housing justice, and counter narratives of historical exclusion in monument culture. So it's in this sense that the work that I center on tends to amplify stories of community care and power. And today, for the most part, I'll be talking about my project, Cities for People, Not for Profit. But first, I was asked to speak a little bit more about myself and what catalyzed me or what activated me towards this work. And none of this would have been possible had it not been personal. My activism was born through self-identity as a first-generation daughter of Ecuadorian immigrants, where I've had to advocate for my parents' rights as well as my own in this country. As a single mother who sought a college education to propel myself out of poverty, as a longtime Bushwick resident fighting against displacement due to gentrification, and as an oral historian and educator at CUNY who wants to see her students get better access to the resources they need to succeed, as well as an activist scholar who recognizes that academia perpetuates inequality. So this has directed me towards where I am now and where I feel I could do the most good for my community, which is mainly expressed through education, art, and activism. And as I'm thinking about that work, I employ counter storytelling as the theoretical framework for my art activist scholarship and creative practice. It grounds my work in the experiences and knowledge of marginalized groups that present their counter stories. As an oral historian, I view oral history as an inclusive exercise that not only documents an individual's story, but also examines social justice themes of institutional power structures and how it perpetuates inequity around us. And it definitely, as a methodology, also aligns with counter storytelling. Both of these approaches help us challenge the perceived wisdom of those in power to provide a context to understand and transform these established belief systems. And it's a persistent theme in my work of decentering authority and providing more voices in my teaching, socially engaged art making and activism and community work. So it's not so much about being the sage on the stage expert, if you will, but it's about surfacing the knowledge that is co-created with the community I'm documenting and collaborating with, or with the students that I'm teaching and learning from. So hopefully that helps situate folks around just what drives me in this work. And so it was with this mindset that I began with this project, Cities for People, Not for Profit, an oral history project that traces the history of ongoing gentrification and the fight for affordable housing in Bushwick from the perspective of artists, activists, and community residents. The interviews focused on ideas concerning the politics, impact, and future of displacement as they're still unfolding in real time in our neighborhood in Bushwick. And the goal was to provide a framework for the community to analyze the effects of this displacement and help ignite relationships amongst the various groups being affected by gentrification. Additionally, the site also has a tab which provides the community with resources, the Activists Toolkit, which has resources on alternative housing strategies, community organizing efforts, and other groups in the area. So during the interview collection stage of this project, initially when I got started back in 2013, and it's been an ongoing project since then, some of the narrators shared stories about housing problems, inadequate community facilities, discrimination, and many other social issues. While conducting multiple in-depth interviews with community organizers specifically, I found that they repeatedly referred to how these experiences with racial inequity were directly linked to the fight to secure more affordable housing in the face of rising rents and increased evictions, particularly towards Latinx tenants, which is a critically recurring theme in these stories that you'll hear on the site. And in 2015, amongst the several narrators that I reached out to and the groups, in 2015, I reached out to Make the Road New York to invite them to participate in the project. And I was introduced to Jose Lopez, who agreed to share his story. And in this clip, which I'll break away in a moment, I just want to give you some context before we play that short clip. He gives us some keen insights into the politics of marketing ethnicity, community marginalization, and class division, and how they cut through neoliberal postures to reveal the real issue at hand, which is who will construct and control Bushwick's future. So let me see if I can play that clip for you all.
I'm seeing some shifts in the neighborhood. Like obviously in the 70s, 80s, there was the fires, crack hit the streets in New York City pretty hard. Bushwick was one of those areas that was devastated by the crack epidemic. Leading up until the 90s, where things and groups like Make the Road, like El Puente and others were starting to, put their boots on the ground with local churches to try and figure out ways where local community residents, folks from Bushwick, can help to transform the neighborhood into a community that better serve their needs. We live in a capitalist country. The idea, not just in Bushwick, but across the country, is that we're going to put profit on people. That is the idea of most homeowners across New York. Definitely the idea of the Real Estate Board of New York, who's one of the most powerful players in the housing game right now in New York City, if not the most powerful player. And I think it's important to understand that, right? This free market system where folks can capitalize and take advantage of others, given current conditions. Dialogue is welcome. We want to have open dialogue, but we also want to make sure that folks coming into the neighborhood respect the fact that, some of us here who've been living here all our lives know the game and have been doing this for a long time.
So it was through my connection with Jose later on in 2015 that I was put in touch with Gladys Puglia, who is another fellow Latinx community organizer, volunteer at the time, but now a former community organizer with Make the Road New York, and also a very active member of the community board here locally in the neighborhood. During her interview, she reflects on her background in Ecuador, immigrating to New York, and her own experience with being offered and refusing a buyout for her rent-stabilized apartment. Since then, Gladys has helped organize tenants' rights support groups of Spanish-speaking local residents, where they are facilitating a movement against buyouts. And she still remains in her rent-stabilized apartment in Bushwick. So here's her short clip. It's done in Spanish and the subtitles should.
Y yo lo único que le pido a esas personas que se están mudando a la área, en estas áreas o en otras áreas, que averigüen el pasado de su apartamento, pidan un historial. Hay un lugar que es el 3, ¿cuál es? El 155 de Hanson, donde pide el DHCR, se llama el departamento. Tú pides el historial del apartamento y tú sabes ahí de que si estás pagando la renta que estás pagando está correcta o te están poniendo algo más de lo que no debes pagar. En eso digo que todo el mundo aprovechen y averigüen para que así sepan las personas que estaban antes cuánto pagaban y por qué ellos están pagando más o el doble o el triple. Que hagan esas averiguaciones porque les va a ser beneficio para su bolsillo, porque así le pueden pelear en la corte y le pueden bajar la renta.
And it's like through this work and through the process as the project kept progressing, I became further activated to join these local collectives in the fight for affordable housing, eventually becoming a core member of Mi Casa No Es Su Casa, and most recently the Bushwick Housing Independence Project. And while I wish to keep documenting how the community is experiencing continued gentrification in Bushwick, I'm also at the same time hoping to work more on building more collaborations with other groups of like-minded folks to find new ways to enhance community engagement with these stories that reflect these instances of resilience and community building, particularly amongst members of the Latinx community, which along those lines, amidst the height of the pandemic in 2020, led to this next collaboration where I partnered with the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project at Cities for People Not-for-Profit, and we both created Nos Cuidamos, which is this collaborative bilingual oral history project documenting stories about how residents of Bushwick organized to meet each other's needs during this time in the pandemic. We conducted the interviews with neighboring residents and organizers participating in mutual aid to understand how their work fits within the larger context of housing organizing and racial justice movements. So the experiences shared so far from the interviews we've been able to collect reflect especially how food and housing insecurity issues as experienced by BIPOC poor and working class communities in Bushwick are intertwined with and further compounded by the pandemic and the ensuing economic crisis. So in this short clip that I'll be playing very shortly, Samuel Namir Olivares, who is district leader for District Assembly 53 and co-founder of Bushwick Ayuda Mutua, reflects on how the current health emergency has magnified the eviction crisis that residents have been fighting for decades. And in this short clip I'm going to play for you, he's talking about the tough choices that many who have been economically impacted are being forced to make. So I'm going to play that audio clip for you now.
The main reasons of people are hungry is because the fear of eviction. And I don't know to which extent this makes sense to people, but the food insecurity stems not because people don't have the money to buy food. Oftentimes, they could figure out a way to make $100 per week somehow to do some work, risking their lives in some sort of service to buy the food. However, the fear of eviction and housing instability and landlord harassment, harassment from the landlords is so big, so dramatic that these people, that our families, our neighbors were willing to go hungry and literally to pay rent. So the majority of the families that we serve, they pay the first 2-3 months. I don't know how, and they do not know either. They spent all the savings that they had. They went out and worked, and they paid the rent, and then they thought about food. So the level of desperation and pressure and oppression and fear that you have to forego at such a critical, life-saving, basic need, and not having enough food for your children, but you have to choose between having a safe shelter or food. It was heartbreaking, and that's why we were actually, because of housing.
And I'm just going to cut it short to be considerate of time, but this past May we had the zine launch party, and it's a celebration basically to celebrate the first issue of the ensuing zine of the Nos Cuidamos project, which was published bilingually. And I believe the link was shared in the chat. If you want to get a digital version of the zine, I totally encourage you all to take a look and please share with those that you think might be interested. The event was really our opportunity to thank our narrators who contributed their stories, as well as their mutual aid groups and members who worked so tirelessly during this really intense time to really care for neighbors in Bushwick amidst this ongoing pandemic and the eviction crisis that we've been facing and are facing now. So thinking about that project as a collaboration between my group and Anti-Eviction Mapping Project with the Nos Cuidamos, our hope is to basically go through these next steps to continue, hopefully collaborating with one another to, as a collective, continue collecting oral history interviews. And activating the zine as a fundraising tool for partnering mutual aid organizations. We had one previously this past October, where we had a fundraising event which raised funds for Comida Pa'l Pueblo, which was one of the mutual aid orgs that we documented in the project. And our hope is that we can continue to use that as a feature and just donate those proceeds to these orgs that are doing the hard work on the ground. And our hope is eventually to unveil an exhibit of these interviews at a listening party gathering in collaboration with between Cities for People, not-for-profit, and Anti-Eviction team members and community stakeholders in the neighborhood to again sort of elicit that community building, which is so essential during this time. And our hope is obviously once we get to share these stories and honor the tenacity of our neighbors in Bushwick, show that give them thanks for the caring of the community and for mobilizing for justice. And this project's framework also aligns with forms of decolonizing storytelling that respect documented communities, a practice that reflects Indigenous traditions of teaching and learning And we believe that these sorts of acts are acts of resistance methodology, if you will, that can also be acts of teaching. And that's all I have for now. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Cynthia. That was amazing. Okay, so our next speaker that I'm very excited for you all to hear from is Walis Johnson. I'm going to read a little bit about Walis and then we'll jump right into it. So Walis Johnson is an interdisciplinary artist, filmmaker, whose work documents the experience and poetics of the urban landscape through oral history, ethnographic film, and artist walking practices. She is particularly interested in the intersection of documentary film, performance, and socially engaged art. Her recent work, the Red Line Archive Project, activates conversations about the personal and political effects of redlining using her own family story growing up in Brooklyn, New York. So I'm very excited for you all to hear from Walis. So anyway, I'm very, very excited to introduce Tomie Arai, who is a colleague of mine. We both are in the Chinatown Art Brigade together, but I have admired her work for a very, very long time. But I'll just read a little bit about her. And again, all the bios, the full extent of the bios are actually on Eventbrite, and I'll be putting their links of their work in the chat. Tomie Arai is a public artist who lives and works in New York City. She has designed both temporary and permanent public works of art for Creative Time, the U.S. General Services Administration Art and Architecture Program, the New York City Percent for Art Program, the Cambridge Arts Council, the MTA Arts for Transit Program, the New York City Board of Education, and San Francisco Arts Commission. In 2015, she co-founded the cultural collective Chinatown Art Brigade. And you can read lots more about her in her longer bio, but that's a little taste of Tomie. So I'm very, very happy for you all to hear from Tomie.
Hi, Betty. Thank you so much. And thank you to KODA for providing us this wonderful framework and context for sharing our mapping practices. I'm not sure I ever really thought about this as mapping practice. I've always thought about mapping as a tool that could be used in conjunction with research, with oral history, with participatory, I guess, activities that can involve people. And so I'm really so thrilled to be seeing these other projects. Betty asked us to talk a little bit about our own practice. I'm a visual artist, and I guess that I'm coming to this kind of engagement through public art. So I think I'm going to share my screen and see if I can talk a little bit at first about what brought me to the Chinatown Art Brigade and working collectively in Chinatown. Let's see. To begin with, I guess, is by way of some personal background. I'm Japanese American, and I think that every Asian family probably has a migration story of some kind. So my story actually begins in Japan with my grandparents, who migrated to the US in the early 1900s and were married in San Francisco in 1913. Like so many Japanese Americans living on the West Coast at that time, and at the time that World War II was started, they were uprooted and forcibly incarcerated in. So they were forcibly uprooted and incarcerated in concentration camps across the country. And after the war, when the camps closed, my parents met and resettled in New York, where I was born and raised. I've lived here all my life. And in post-war New York, Harlem was really one of the few areas of the city where Japanese were welcomed and could find housing. So my parents and I lived in Harlem in my early years, and I wanted to include this photograph of my extended family resting on a stoop in Harlem because I thought it captured the really crazy mix, the hybrid mix of cultures that we are all made of, from Toyosan in China and Kyushu, Japan, Trinidad, India, and Mississippi to New York. These trans-Pacific and transatlantic stories have become such an important part of my work. And I guess tracing these journeys, the distance and dislocation, the yearning for home and homeland that members of my family have experienced have always been at the core of what I do. So it seems natural that I've come to mapping as a way to record and just try to make sense of the people and places in my life. I just wanted to share a few projects that I've done across many decades, actually, starting with this print, which is called Return, that was created for the Arizona Humanities Council to be given as a gift to the Colorado River Indian tribes. The Gila River and Colorado Indian tribes were the site of two Japanese concentration camps during World War II. And when I was invited or commissioned to do this piece, I really knew nothing about this history. The first thing I did was I started with a map, a map of the camps that were located on tribal lands. And I extended, I guess, out of that space into, and I was very fortunate to be welcomed on the tribal lands by the elders who invited me to speak to the students and to senior citizens and to learn more about the history of the space by actually being physically there. I think that I began to see mapping as a way to not just understand my own history and the history of my family, but a way to provide a counter narrative to what existed. And so in this commissioned project, which was a mural commemorating the discovery of the African burial ground in Lower Manhattan in the 1990s, the first thing I did was begin with a map of the burial ground. And it was clear at the time, which was almost 30, 40 years ago, that there was very little that had been written about the enslaved descendants of the African community and the enslaved people who were brought here and actually helped build Manhattan. So I really saw the importance of beginning with the physical space and trying to understand the history of what came before us. The mural not only memorialized the discovery of really one of the most important archaeological discoveries of this country, an African burial ground that was a resting place for over 20,000 enslaved Africans. But it became a touchstone for researching and learning about the history of Africans in New York and the descendant African American community. And it opened up the possibility to collaborate with so many amazing historians and activists and the actual descendants who were so intent on recovering and reclaiming their history. In 20 2007, I was invited to participate in an oral history project with residents of Chinatown that was entitled Archaeology of Change, Tales of Gentrification in New York Chinatown. And once again, I began with a map of the Chinatown core. And through this collaboration with writer Lena Z and over 27 interview subjects, we were able to explore the actual physical neighborhood and the boundaries that had expanded so much since the very beginnings of this community. One of the things that we became very clear was that there really aren't just one Chinatown or one destination place for Chinese in New York. There are actually Chinatowns in Sunset Park and Elmhurst, and in all over the boroughs that are beginning to become home for Chinese immigrants that are really not on the map, literally. So this project was a way to think about the lived experiences of the Chinese in New York and how their experiences in their economic situation and what they were facing were common experiences that were shared by people across the country. We began by looking at the neighborhood and trying to ask people just in a very simple way, what they perceived as the change that they were witnessing. How had the neighborhood transformed since they arrived there? And it was clear that so many places that were embedded with memories and were so important to the culture and to the lives of the people who are living there had been displaced, and almost all the people that we interviewed had experienced some enormous hardship or loss directly related to housing, to the conditions that they were living in, and to the rise of so much luxury development in the community that it felt as if the community had been transformed almost overnight. The man that you see in the lower right corner, Mr. Chen, was the last manager of Music Palace, a theater. There used to at one time be 3 movie theaters in Chinatown that were quickly displaced by the video industry, but were also seen as sort of cultural meeting spaces. And the Music Palace was one of the most popular theaters. It was located on the Bowery. And at the time that we interviewed Mr. Chan, he took us to the site, which was really just a hole in the ground. And we realized that this really fabled institution was not only gone, but it was going to be replaced by a hotel. One of the reasons why this place had significance to me, a special place in my heart, was because in 1977, I painted a mural on the side of the Music Palace with a group of Chinese youth from the local middle school. And I was surprised to hear how many people, through the course of our conversations with people from the community, remembered that mural. It had become, for some people, just a way of of navigating through Chinatown. You know, they would, if they didn't live in Chinatown, they would meet at the mural with their families from out of town and go to the theater or go to a restaurant. If they did live in the neighborhood, it was just a signal that they were almost home. So, you know, I was very moved by hearing how important some of these spaces were. And it was actually this conversation that I had with Mr. Chan and the disappearance of the Music Palace that made me realize how gentrification had really taken hold and impacted the community. And it was not long after that that I met Betty and Nancy Kong, and we began to talk about forming a kind of cultural collective that would center issues of displacement and gentrification in our work. The Chinatown Art Brigade was founded in 2015 by activist members of the Chinatown community, media makers, and visual artists, photographers, filmmakers who were interested in seeing how we could use our work to advance social change and stop some of the just the luxury development that we were witnessing was destroying the neighborhood. We were very fortunate to have been approached by CAV, Organizing Asian Communities, to do a project together. And we, from very early on, partnered with CAV and the Chinatown Tenants Union to think about a way that we could talk about not just displacement, but the lack of affordable housing that in Chinatown and across the city, and ways to help tenants stay in their homes. Just some of the data that was generated by Betty about the conditions of Chinatown really pointed to a situation that was not only dire, but an emergency, a crisis. And of course, now because of the pandemic, we're witnessing an eviction crisis that you know is something that needs to be addressed immediately. At the time, you know, we were asked to do a public project. We didn't really feel like we had the time to go through a city bureaucracy, so we began to do a series of public projections that amplified some of the messages that the tenants wanted to share with the neighborhood and with the city council and with people who they felt needed to be uplifted and encouraged, you know, in their fight against displacement. And so we did a series of projections. We worked with tenants to create messages and call for the city council to approve a rezoning plan. We also incorporated participatory ways to share these messages. This was the People's Pad, where we invited passersby and residents to write their messages in real time and have them projected through our partners, the Illuminator, who I'm sure many of you are familiar with the work that they've done since Occupy, to work with groups to project and create these light interventions in public spaces with social messaging. CAB, the Chinatown Art Brigade, also participated in tenant meetings, story circles that allowed people to share what was there in their mind in a safe space in very intimate ways. We made sure to have interpreters at every meeting, and we worked with the tenants to help explain what zoning was. We attended zoning workshops and called for a town hall along with CAV about rezoning, which is, I'm sure you're all aware, you know, so instrumental in having community participate in the ways in which they would like to see their um, development controlled and benefit the people who live there. And mapping was one of the central ways that we got people to think about the neighborhood and really take a long, hard look at what it meant to see changes visually in the spaces that they live in. And I was, I'm always very inspired by the work of the anti-eviction mapping project, and I feel that in this process of engaging with community, I've learned so much from other groups who have been doing mapping, and who are so experienced in the collection of data and information about the spaces that they are trying to transform and change. And I think that the collection of data was an important part of this project, but on a very simple level, looking at the neighborhood block by block and mapping out the changes that we were observing. But it's certainly what the aggregation of data certainly wasn't the end goal. And just as the anti-eviction mapping project has said, mapping for the sake of mapping was never the goal, but really just a way to think about how we can connect with the spaces that we live in and design ways to incorporate change or envision change. So the mapping workshops that we conducted with tenants allowed us to give them a chance to remap the community in their own voices. And we conducted community-led placekeeping walks that were based on maps that the community members shared with us. And these walks also included interviews with the participants, chalking exercises in front of spaces that had been built over spaces that were embedded with their memories. And of course, in the course of this, I guess, observing the change in the community, we began to see the proliferation of galleries that were replacing small businesses and white box spaces, that had increased rents and destroyed businesses that had served and benefited the community at one time. So we held a public meeting with stakeholders from the community in a store in Chinatown, and we were very privileged to be able to hold our first meeting at Wing On Wo, one of the oldest porcelain shops in Chinatown. And invited galleries and artists to participate. Only one gallery actually responded, but this initial meeting was where we met Elizabeth Moy, who later joined the Chinatown Art Brigade, and told us that she had created a map of all the galleries in Chinatown. And of course, we all know that galleries are often a revolving door of different businesses, and this map is probably, with the exception of a few of the galleries that I see here, probably completely obsolete. But at the time, it was clear that dozens and dozens of galleries were being opened at the expense of small businesses. And so the map that Liz created became the basis for a town hall that mobilized artists and galleries to take a long, hard look at their complicity in gentrifying the community, and come together to discuss how artists could participate in helping the community. And out of that, we created a pledge, which wasn't really a pledge. It was really just a way to get artists to think about how they could stop becoming weapons of mass displacement, and think more intentionally about how their presence in a community like Chinatown could harm or benefit the people who live there. We also participated as a result of that town hall and pledge in protesting the presence of a racist exhibition not too far from the CAV offices, that not only mobilized so many people in the community to think about ways in which culture and art have been used to art wash luxury development, but have been used as a way to devalue the culture that already exists there. So this was the first of many direct actions that CAB participated in and helped to organize. Our involvement with the 9 weeks of action at the Whitney through our partnership with to colonize this place was a way for us to think about how cultural institutions have or haven't served communities like Chinatown. And through the 9 weeks of action, we were asked to organize a anti-displacement walking tour, mapping different cultural institutions on the Lower East Side in Chinatown who had boards, were people who, like Jonathan Chu and developers, were sitting and were actually using those institutions to benefit their business interests and profit, from their connection to cultural institutions that ultimately made what they were doing look good. So this actually was a beginning of our calls for the chair of the board of the Museum of Chinese in America, Jonathan Chu, who's a real estate developer, to step down. And we've been very involved since then in calling out the museum's complicity in receiving concessions from the de Blasio's borough-wide jail plan in exchange for their silence about a jail being built in Chinatown. And am I okay with time, Betty? I'm not sure how far.
Yeah, maybe a few more minutes. Yeah, we'll cut down on the discussion part and we'll go to Q&A. So no worries. But maybe like 3 more minutes,
Sure.
more? Yeah.
So this takes me to the mapping project that Betty asked me to speak about, which was initially called Here to Stay. We changed the name to Housing for the People Mapping Project, which began with a series of workshops with the tenants, and just very intense discussions about boundaries of Chinatown, who live there, what kinds of conditions were people living in. Personal stories were shared, and we interviewed and filmed tenant organizers to learn more about the campaigns that they were leading around stopping evictions. Know Your Rights information was shared through one video about evictions and how to ask for legal help if you were fighting your landlord to stay in your home. we began by proposing to do a project with but that would involve videos and that you could access through your phone, but it seemed like QR codes were the easiest way for the tenants to access the interviews that we had collected. So we incorporated video that you could listen to in the CAV offices, as well as QR codes that allowed you to, yes, it wasn't augmented, but it was actually a QR code that people could use to listen to the stories that we had collected through our mapping project. These are some of the tenants enjoying the videos that we created. As part of our mapping project, we also created a timeline of activism and different campaigns that CAV, Organizing Asian Communities, had participated in during their 30-year history. And we're still actually working on this mapping project. It was always, for me, a work in progress that was open-ended and just like our neighborhoods are. So mapping the memories, stories, and of resistance and the activism in our community is our next project. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Tomie. That was incredible.
Oops.
So much rich work. I love that first image of your grandparents, no, great-grandparents, I think you said, right? Anyway, it's beautiful.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Yes.
Thank you, Betty, and thank you, KODA, for inviting me to present to you today. I'm just gonna share my screen. Thank you, Betty, and I'm really in awe of the work that I saw by the two other artists. My story is a little bit different. It's on a much smaller scale, but nonetheless is a mapping practice. Betty, you can go to the next slide. So yeah, I just wanted to kind of define some terms, like what is social practice? Not everybody knows, but it really invites collaboration or co-creation with individuals or communities and institutions in creating a participatory artwork. And certainly we saw examples of that with the other two presentations. And in some instances, the social interaction is meant to drive or inspire, but also complete the project. And I think that's where my work falls. So I work with oral history interviews and artist walking practices as a way of knowing and as a way of doing research. And of course, always historical research. So I think we heard a little bit about, how do we decolonize our spaces, especially in light of the aggressive, hyper-aggressive gentrification that's going on in the city. And so much of the gentrification that has happened has been the result of something that was called the 1938 Federal Housing and Loan Owners Association Red Line Maps. And we've heard a lot in recent years about red line maps. And my project is very specific about exploring the red line map of Brooklyn. So I created a personal archive of documents that I discovered upon the death of my mother and placed them in a little homemade, do-it-yourself mobile archive that I was taking around to different neighborhoods, including my own, to explore people's understanding of what redlining is and what it did to the city and how it continues to impact our lives today. So on the death of my mother in 2013, the same day, or I think the next day, I got this note. And it's like, I am interested in buying your building. I will pay cash now or in the future. And that kind of started me, first it got me very upset, but then, then it started me on this journey of really investigating redlining and what it has meant. My parents bought their house in 1968, which was the first year of the Fair Housing Act of 1968, which actually allowed, opened up the banking industry so that it would finally lend to people of color, Black people in particular, so that they could buy and own homes in their own communities and elsewhere. And so part of my project is about tracing the periphery of the red line maps to really see what are the remnants, what are the traces of redlining that we can see in the landscape today, and to have to begin a dialogue with people about that history. And this is me actually drawing a red line in the snow in my neighborhood in Brooklyn. So this is a red line map. It's the 1938 Homeowners Loan Corporation map. And these maps were created in over 230, I think it's 238 cities. And basically it categorized each neighborhood to determine whether it was worth investing in or whether it was worth lending money for people to get mortgages or insurance or be funded for businesses. So as you can see, this particular map, there's a lot of red, and if you actually look at all of the New York City maps, there's quite a bit of red, not a lot of green. Green was designated as the best neighborhoods. And then blue was the second best. Yellow was declining, and you can see from the legend it was declining or considered hazardous for investment, or beginning to be hazardous for investment. And then red was absolutely hazardous. And in fact, red was considered inharmonious, meaning any kind of so-called race mixing was considered socially inharmonious for the society. So these maps not only designated where money was going to go, but who got to live next door to whom. And as you can see, the neighborhoods in the northern part of this map are now some of the most expensive real estate in Brooklyn today: Williamsburg, Greenpoint, Bedford-Stuyvesant. Large swaths of Cobble Hill, Borum Hill, Carroll Gardens, all of these places were redlined. But in particular, we know of the really the vast gentrification that's gone on in northern Brooklyn in Williamsburg, which has really been transformed in my lifetime over the last 15 to 20 years. So this is just a picture of the red line map of Manhattan, and you can see all the way up the east side, it's all red. So if you look at what's going on, especially in Chinatown and the Lower East Side, all of these places were designated for urban renewal, and those red areas were, particularly with Robert Moses and others, designated for slum clearance. So tenements or affordable housing that used to be there were demolished, and new buildings were put up, and also public housing was put up to house those people who were displaced or evicted as a result of the demolition. And there's only a very little part of green, and green actually designated the areas that had the most rigid clauses in their deeds that explicitly stated that you could not sell to Black people. And so they sent out people to take a look at neighborhoods and decide and fill out these forms, which basically were very explicit, the infiltration of Negroes. If the neighborhood was 3% Black, then that neighborhood would be designated red. And this was true not only of Black people, but also of Italians, of Russians, of Jews. So initially, before World War II, they were on the list to be redlined. And then after World War II, they were assimilated into whiteness and encouraged actually to move to the suburbs. So, so the project is really about the past and how we can perhaps still see the past, this very, very painful, destructive past, as we walk the red line maps. And that's exactly what I did for this project. I walked the northern part of the Brooklyn Red Line map, all the way from Greenpoint around Bedford-Stuyvesant, Crown Heights, Fort Greene, just to see what was left of those old neighborhoods and old ethnicities that used to live in those areas. And you can see very clearly who used to live in, let's say, Crown Heights. This is a church that was, or rather a synagogue that was repurposed into a church, and you can see the Star of David on the top of the cornice there. And, it was also a kind of poetic journey, a way for me to kind of imagine with my own lens what I was seeing in the landscape. So these are two buildings, one with kind of a white kind of trim and one with black kind of trim. And it had a kind of symbolic value for me, a metaphoric value for me. And this was a neighborhood in Bed-Stuy, Shoes with Flowers, and that became symbolic of just sort of the ability of people to stay in spite of everything and to dream on. So the project is really about land. What does it mean to inhabit a place, to quote unquote own a piece of property? What does it mean to be a citizen of this country? And what does it mean to be free, given this horrendous history that Black people and other people of color have experienced in New York City and in this country? And to consider how much the past is present, always. So this is the archive. I would take it around to to three neighborhoods in particular: Fort Greene, which is the neighborhood that I live in, Crown Heights, which at the time and still is really being aggressively gentrified, and Bedford-Stuyvesant. And actually, this is the archive in Bed-Stuy. And these are my parents. So, what I tried to do with this project is really kind of evoke an era and evoke kind of the aspirations of people, and to kind of integrate my own family's story with the story of New York. My grandparents, what I discovered, owning property often, as we now know and often hear about, is if your ancestors own property. So my grandparents were lucky enough to own their home in Queens, which was in a yellow transitional area. They bought their house from a Jewish couple who I presume moved to the suburbs. And that's their deed. So all of these things and pictures or images are in the archive. I collected soil samples of the different neighborhoods and labeled them with the color that they would have been on the original red line map, so that people could could kind of understand that that was the color then. And of course, probably every single one of these areas is now green, except probably for East New York. Again, free people of color. You know, what does it mean to be free? And these are some of the other artifacts in the archive. And so the objects are really conversation starters. So people get to talk about what my hope was that people would talk more about what their experience was with land ownership, or if their family moved to the suburb, did they know why their parents moved to the suburbs or their grandparents moved to the suburbs, or did they even understand what was the pull, why were they being pulled back into the city, why did they want to live in the city now? So the project is for everyone to consider their position vis-a-vis the gentrification and displacement and discrimination that continues today. Somebody owning with an Ebony magazine next. And then to get quotes from people, a copy of the letter is in the archive. The person says, we get these letters all the time. There's an older woman on the block who was offered $350,000 in cash in a suitcase asking if she wanted to sell. And of course, $350,000 was like hardly anything. I'm sure her property was worth much more than that. And the shoes with the flowers appear, often in my work. And one of the people who saw that said, my interpretation is that the shoes represent feet on the ground, being grounded. It's footprints of the community not being lost. We are reclaiming it. So for me, just having a walking practice, creates a set of possibilities for how we can begin to reconnect and re-explore our communities and also connect with each other and each other's stories. So, but this was a work in progress. So there were some issues with the archive, and I found myself as the one who was doing most of the talking, explaining my story and talking about my story. And many people, though they knew something about redlining, they didn't immediately understand how it operated and continues to operate today. And then also, I was really interested in people thinking on a deeper level about, what this means for themselves as citizens of this country, as well, we consider ourselves free people, and to contemplate, what this means for housing overall, and gentrification and displacement and eviction and all of the things that we see all the time now. So I created a labyrinth in public space where people would take a card that had a question on it or a comment, and they would meditate on this comment or question as they walked the labyrinth. And labyrinths have been used across history as a way to kind of deepen a spiritual practice or to help a person answer a question that cannot be easily answered. Betty, if you click the title there, I think hopefully something will come up. Yeah. So this is just a little taste of the what happens when people walk the labyrinth. Some of their comments. You can.
Black population, your area was going to be. I picked up legacies of wealth. I've always called myself a legacy in the co-op that I live in. So, it was a fight to the finish to stay in the co-op, not because I couldn't, it was because the co-op tried to redline me. And I call it that. But my mother made provisions so that I would stay. And I didn't know it until I needed to know it. So it was emotional. It was emotional. I think that we have to really understand redlining and how difficult it was, and how people just really wanted to live, and they needed loans, and they needed, they wanted homes. And you've been put into a bracket that you're not a good citizen, you're not a good risk.
I like the time that it took to walk it, and the fact that I knew where I was headed to, but also that I was constrained by the lines. I live in Bed-Stuy, so it's gone through many stages of redlining and blockbusting, and yeah.
So it's made to be kind of ephemeral. So, and I can kind of install this in different places. So it's meant to be ephemeral. So, it can be broken down and installed somewhere else, but it kind of lends, the sort of temporariness of it lends it a kind of poetic quality. And yeah, so people kind of get into it, and they that's just one person just pouring a libation at the center of the labyrinth. And this is at Weeksville Heritage Center, which is a place that I do a lot of work just because I think symbolically, metaphorically, it really kind of connects to the themes that I'm exploring. So again, what does it mean to be a free Black woman in Brooklyn? And that's the question that I think about for myself. And then oral history. So there are other people's oral history projects that I've used to build some of my own work. So this was a project that I did in East New York. It's called We Walk in a Field of Dreams. And the picture on the right is of a man whose family used to live in East New York. And East New York was really the center of some of the most vicious redlining, blockbusting, terrible practices in Brooklyn and probably in New York, just horrible neglect and running people out of the neighborhood so that the homes could be sold for higher prices to Black people and other people of color, and then completely denying that neighborhood any kind of real services in the 70s and 80s and 90s, and even going till now, but things are shifting. That's just another close-up of a labyrinth that I built with shoes. And this was a project that I also collaborated with another artist, Paul Supat, and he created this sculpture that went into the gazebo of this park. So I am a oral historian, and I've worked on a few projects. This is one about public safety in Crown Heights. And it was a way to help people talk about what the issue of public safety is in Crown Heights, and police safety, and all of the things that go along with that. This was in 2017, I believe. Walking practices, we can go next. So these are other kinds of mapping projects that really center walking. So if you want to click that one, this is called this was just before the pandemic, 2019, the Brooklyn League of Women Walkers, and this was a way for women in the communities of Red Hook and Red Hook. What was the other community? Red Hook primarily, and Sunset Park. I'm sorry, Sunset Park, to explore their community. So this is about 1.5 minutes long. You want to click that?
I don't go there at night. Where do you feel? The idea of know that
So you can stop that, Betty. Thank you. Yeah, so this is a group that I'm going to try and revive next year if we, you know, if we can. Um, have some other ideas for walks for the Brooklyn League of Women Walkers. And the next slide. Sorry. Okay, so this is the most recent. So, during the pandemic, I was doing a lot of writing and a lot of processing. I wrote an article called Walking the Red Line. And it was about exploring the geography of racism and about the red line maps and what it feels like to be a woman who inherits property given all of this terrible history. And I talk a lot about the embodied practice of walking. And this is the latest. This is the latest book or article that I've written called "Joy is the Sound," and it's called Redline Promptings, and it's a series of prompts and photographs. You can go on, Betty. Next slide. That again, we have the reappearance of the shoes with the flowers, and it's a series of prompts or instructions that people can do as they walk or think about as they walk. This is Shirley Chisholm State Park, and this is one of the prompts. So create a balm for a wound that cannot be seen, give clear instruction, share with a friend. So, if I were to say what is my work about, it's like Carrie Mae Weems said it much better than I could ever say it. I'm interested in the tangled web of history and the rough edges and the bumpy surface, the mess just beneath the veneer of order. I want to make things that are beautiful, seductive, formally challenging, and culturally meaningful. I'm also committed to radical social change. Any form of human injustice moves me deeply.
Thank you so much. That was great to end on that quote. I love that quote. I've seen it before, and yeah, her work is amazing. So thank you, Walis. And I don't know if Tomie and Cynthia can all kind of reemerge with their cameras on. Thank you so much. That was really great. So I guess we should, let's get right to any questions that folks might have. I see a few already in the Q&A. So let's see. I'm going to, I guess, read them aloud. The first question is from Rachel. And Rachel asks, I'm curious about how people feel about being filmed and recorded when they are interviewed. Are people ever hesitant? And if so, what do you do? Do people sign waivers? How do you prepare people for their interviews? Do they know the questions ahead of time? Thanks. So I guess anyone who wants to kick it off, maybe Cynthia or Tomie, so you can get a breath, Walis.
I'm happy to step in unless you would like to answer that, Tomie.
Go ahead. Go ahead, Cynthia.
But yeah, consent matter very much because with this kind of documentary work, it's so important to really respect your narrators. And the only way you're able to do that is if you build this sense of mutual trust and understanding. With my work, I'm always very interested in making it publicly available, but for whatever reason, if people do feel uncomfortable, I give them obviously the imperative saying that they're in the driver's seat of all the interviews that they participate in. And if at any time they want to stop recording, we stop recording. I also sort of have like a takedown policy, no questions asked for any interview I collect. So if after a while they change their minds, which people are entitled to do, take it down. Don't need to have a reason. Fine. I've worked on other projects where I've worked with arrangements to give the narrator autonomy to decide who gets to listen to their story. So I may list them, but their interview would not be publicly available unless they approve of who is viewing that interview. So there are many different ways you can arrange those sorts of agreements with folks. But yeah, consent is a very big deal in oral history.
I just wanted to add that the collection of data is sometimes an ethical question. I mean, that raises a lot of ethical issues, and people are not data, really.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I so appreciate the projects where people make an attempt to build relationships with their narrators and the subjects they interview. That isn't always possible, but I do feel like, especially now when so many people, for example, are archiving the pandemic or Black Lives Matter protests or any manner of very traumatic experiences for people, I think that you have to really be very careful about people's feelings, and total transparency is always very important, that people are allowed to see what you're going to use, and that certainly, it's always done with respect, and whatever is published or presented or shared has to be co-authored. I mean, there has to be this sense that you're doing it together. You're not taking something or a story that somebody owns and using it for your own project or purposes.
Walis, did you want to take that on?
Yeah, I mean, I guess for my own project, the archive project, I used oral histories more as a way to research. It was like the first place I began to kind of think about, what do people know? What do I know? How do they feel? And so wasn't necessarily done with the intention of broadcasting it out there. And then, like, for example, with the Labyrinth Project, I mean, people write things down, they're little short, little reflections on what their own experiences are. And I kind of, I mean, it's very broad, right, the definition, but it's an oral history in the moment, and in some ways I haven't really even figured out what to do with the reflections that people have, except in the moment we put them up and you can see them. And so there is an awareness for the people that that's what they're doing, that other people can see it. It's anonymous, of course, but other people can see their reflections and think about their own reflections.
And I don't have the link, but if you go to the Oral History Association, OHA, they have written pretty nicely about the ethics of doing oral history. And some of your concerns could be.
Yeah, I mean, one of the reasons I kind of love oral history is because it does have ethics. I mean, I'm not saying documentary doesn't, but they're very clear, often clear lines, like Cynthia said, this is a collaboration between the narrator and the interviewer. It doesn't belong to the interviewer. Just because they ask the questions, and people can decide to change their mind, which for a lot of documentary work is you're going in with a focused understanding of the question. You're going to take it, you're going to use it in your film. Person signs away their rights.
That's great. Yeah, thank you for jumping in there. I know Tomie froze, so thank you for, and I'm sure she'll come right back. But Rachel says, thank you so much. I appreciate the insight and thoughtfulness. The next question comes from Shanika. I'm so sorry if I'm not pronouncing your name correctly. But the question here is, can you please speak to how you all are incorporating an intersectional lens, if at all, that, for instance, addresses disability and LGBTQIA communities within communities of color without marginalizing them?
I mean, I could sort of try to wrangle with that question because that's one that I've also been struggling with my work. And with Cities for People, Not for Profit, it's been a collaborative experience. And to echo what Tomie emphasized with her work, it is co-created, but not to the extent that included or did that active outreach, because at that time I wasn't exposing myself. And so now that I'm much more aware of my positionality, and I think that that's what I really do appreciate about oral history and doing this kind of work, that it really does provide a mirror to your limitations and how you have to keep on being open to learning more new ways of knowing and being as inclusive. And when you think you're inclusive, guess what? You're not being as inclusive as you thought you were. And always revisiting, being open to the ability to revisit your practices and to improve. And so with this new project I'm working on with Donde Puedo Ir, which is documenting Latinx perspectives of displacement in Bushwick, it's going to be combining music with oral history. We've tried to be as mindful as we possibly could, with at the same time acknowledging the limitations that can take part in just making sure that we are trying to be as open and doing the outreach to reach out to these communities. But knowing our own limitations, it's a 2-person team with very limited funding. We're going to not be able to include everyone, but it's sort of like we're presenting it as our humble slice of life in Bushwick at this particular time with the narrators we were able to encounter in our voyage to complete this project. And our hope is that by next year, February, actually, we'll have the performance ready. And again, it's sort of just like, it's an interesting exercise because it takes what we do naturally as oral historians and storytellers to a new level in regards to not just the oral history and the interview, but the artwork that comes out of that. And opening it up to the narrators to be sitting in the process with us as we create the music. Are you all right with the way you're being represented with this musical piece? And that's another form of inclusion, which as artists too, like, it's such a personal expression, but when you're including other voices and other stories of other people's experiences, it is no longer just solely your experience. So it's like it's a balancing act and being open to learning.
Yep, that's great. Yeah. Wallace?
Yeah, I have to be honest, I didn't really think as much as about this, but walking, right? Like someone with a disability walking around a labyrinth. I hadn't that I'm so glad for this question because now I can really incorporate that in my work. To think about what does it mean to walk physically or to be, in some other kind of vehicle or so yeah, so when I do this Brooklyn League of Women Walkers, Brooklyn League of Women, everybody, not just, like really have to think some of that stuff through. So it does, invite. It's an invitation for everybody.
Yeah, no, that's a graceful answer, but I also think that you do invite people through these different modes of the different mediums that you present, the walking and
bringing the archive to people too.
I was just going to say, yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Oh, yeah.
In people's neighborhoods, and I think that, and it's online. I put links in the chat. And so, but there are, yeah, but you're absolutely right. Those are all, it's important to ask ourselves these questions. And then our last question that we have time for, and Tomie just texted me, her computer just literally died and crashed. So she's kind of in the middle of trying to restart it. And I told her, she can come back, but it might take a minute, depending on her computer situation. So the last question comes from Aisha. Are there plans to show all of these together to illustrate the intersectionality of these collective racialized experiences?
These are all great questions, by the way.
Yeah. So these collective racialized experiences and history of the states. Well, that's interesting for all of it, but maybe reframing it, Aisha, if that's okay with you, kind of like I'm sure your projects have been out there. I know that. So just thinking about, would you all be interested in figuring out how we can, talking about other places that you're planning on sharing this out in, and that kind of thing, you know.
I'm always down to collaborate. Always.
I think the synergy between you two in terms of Brooklyn, you know, neighborhoods that, you know, there's so much synergy there between Bushwick and the Crown Heights and Clinton Hill and Fort Greene, all of that.
And honestly, I'm really humbled because everyone's work is so inspiring, honestly. So like, if folks deem it worth pursuing, please, but I would be delighted. And I mean, there is just so much overlap with the projects, right? From the internal, personal, evocative, poetic to like these grander actions, but we're in no ways limited. And I think there is strength in numbers, and the collaborations are what see it through, really.
That's a great point. Yeah, Walis?
Yeah, you know, it's just, it's, yeah, I would love to think of ways to bring together all our work. And
Come to Bushwick.
yeah, maybe I'll walk. You know, I actually
have a
planned for some
labyrinth.
fun day.
You were talking about your labyrinth. There's a labyrinth at Maria Hernandez Park.
Oh yes, I know. Right.
The one with the parrot in the middle. It's lovely.
Yeah, yeah. So, yeah, no, you know, I'm hoping to do this walking project and other things. Yeah, I'm just I guess my work, I'm also so admiring of everybody else, and my work is meant to is really trying to explore what the interior landscape is like, you know, of people and how they process their own privilege or they're not. It's not, you know, I'm trying to include the gentrifiers, even though, you know, I don't want to, you know, like just because, you know, that's maybe how change happens. I don't know. You know, like they need to know what's going on with them.
Yeah, and I mean, I have to give a shout out to other folks who do such important work with collaborators like Bridget with Fibro Story Project, who's done such a great job of just linking those connections back to different communities through the city, which is really admirable work. And it is like sort of like this inevitability of having to speak with folks who come into communities. And she's done such a great job of like doing that outreach and providing spaces for folks to be like, can you be more mindful as you enter these spaces? Because we don't live in isolation as much as we are fooled into thinking that we do, especially in a city as complex as New York, right? You're going to bump into people.
Yeah. Oh, sorry about that. Tomie, you're back. No, we just have a few minutes left, but maybe we can just ask you the question before, which I have to go back to answer, which was around intersectionality. It was can you speak to all how you all are incorporating an intersectional lens, if any at all, for instance, addressing disability and LGBTQIA communities within communities of color without marginalizing them? So yeah, so we just did that round, folks just kind of answering that question, and I guess this can be the last question. Tomie, if you want to take that.
Well, yeah, I think we should all embrace, you know, the principles of disability justice that are put out by San Invalid. I feel like it's made such a tremendous difference in my work to be aware, you know, of having the people who are most vulnerable lead, and to really think about how, you know, what is normal, you know, and what are we really striving for in our work, in our careers, in whatever we do. You know, are we trying to really change the system, or are we just, or reform it? You know, I mean, we really need to think about dismantling and rebuilding. Sorry, I'm so sorry.
That's okay.
The rest
That's
of the
okay. I think
conversation.
we're wrapping up. So someone just, Carmen just says, you know, how can we stay updated with everyone's work? Hopefully you were here, I don't know, at the top of the program, but anyway, I've been putting in links in the chat but we will email out all these links to folks who participated. But I don't know if folks want to just this last round say how it's best to stay up to date on your work, whether it's a website or an email or Instagram or whatever. And any last parting words you have before we sign off. So I can start with Cynthia.
Online and unfortunately, because the digital divide and all that, but definitely the website links that have been provided. And I'm also happy to put in my project website as well for folks to sign up for the mailing list too. So.
Oh, perfect. Yeah, that's great. Walis?
Yeah, you can just check my website. I am going to be working on it, and it's going to be my name, actually, walisjohnson.com. So I think if you go to that or either one of them, I'm sure you'll be directed to.
Yeah, thanks.
Join my walking group.
Yes.
If it comes about, I hope it does. Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, very happy to be connected with all of you, and thank you, Betty, for putting my info in the chat. You could always turn to that.
Yeah, we'll make sure everyone gets it, gets all the links. And I don't know if Claudia, if you want to say any last parting words, or maybe we can close. But thank you so much for staying. For those of you who stayed the full 2 hours, we're very, very thankful. And I'm so happy about this conversation and discussion. Really great questions, and you all have such depth, this complexity to your work, and there's so much overlap, and I hope that we can all stay in touch in some way. Yeah, Claudia, I didn't know if you had any last things you wanted to say, housekeeping or whatever things.
I just wanted to thank all of you for this wonderful discussion and for great presentations. Thank you to everybody else for joining the discussion and for staying for 2 hours with us.
Cool. All right. Well, have a good night, everyone, and thank you so much.
Thank you so
See you
much, Betty.
soon.
Thank you for inviting
Thank
me.
you. Thank you.
Thank you for.
Yeah.
Thank you. Great to meet
Thank you,
everyone.
KODA, Walis, Tomie, Cynthia, Claudia.
KODA, thank you.
All right. See you soon.
Bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye.